Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Asaf Amarowski. I'm the executive director of ASMIA, and it is my pleasure to once again welcome you to our ASMIA webinar series. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity to talk to our friend Tricia Bacon. Tricia is a professor at American University. She's an expert on foreign policy. She's going to be discussing her latest book with us this afternoon, entitled The Counterinsurgency Dilemma: Foreign Fighter Influence on Insurgencies in Afghanistan and Somalia. Obviously, a very timely topic given everything else that's going on in the region, and another dimension to what's going on in Somalia and the impact in Afghanistan, obviously, on the war when it comes to Iran. There is much to unpack here. Tricia, by training, has had government as well as academic experience. Her personal connection to us here at ASMIA is, of course, that she's also on the editorial board of our journal, and we are proud to showcase many of our members and the work that they are doing. As far as housekeeping wise, Tricia will talk for about a half hour or so and dissect unpack a lot of the issues she's talking about and researching in her book. And then we will go into Q&A. Q&A will be done via the chat. All you have to do is type in your question and we'll do our best to respond. If we do not get to all your questions, we'll respond after the webinar as well. So really, without further ado, Tricia, thank you for joining us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Okay, great. Hopefully you can see the slides effectively. Always the question when you do a virtual presentation. Thank you so much, Asaf, for hosting me today. I really appreciate ASMIA's role in the field, and it's great to be with you all today to talk about my new book, The Counterinsurgency Dilemma. And it is a book that has been maybe a longer labor than some. So I'm particularly grateful that it is out into the world and I'm having an opportunity to speak with you all about it today. So to open up, I want to sort of put up a gallery of people that probably a lot of people on this Zoom know. These are men who have really shaped the broader Sunni jihadist movement. We have leaders of al-Qaida and al-Qaida in Iraq and the Islamic State. We have prominent propaganda figures and people who are the masterminds of major terrorist attacks. But they also share another thing in common, and that is that they all served as foreign fighters in conflicts that spanned basically 4 decades. And some of them even fought in multiple conflicts. But despite their role and their influence in the broader Sunni jihadist movement as a whole, their influence was much more mixed when they were in foreign fighter roles. Some did exert significant influence over their local insurgent counterparts. Probably most notably is Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and Ibn al-Khattab. In those cases, they had extensive influence in the insurgencies in Iraq and Chechnya, respectively. But interestingly, they fought in multiple conflicts, and they didn't enjoy the same influence in the conflicts they fought in previously. In Zarqawi's case, this was in Afghanistan. In Khattab's case, this was in both Afghanistan and Tajikistan. And it raises sort of an interesting question about why even really prominent foreign fighters would sometimes struggle to exert influence over their local insurgent counterparts. And more broadly, why we would see such variation in foreign fighter influence, even in these very notable cases. So my book is really looking at this question of why foreign fighters do reshape some local insurgent movements, some conflicts, but not others. And importantly, this book is not about that first gallery of infamous foreign fighters. It's about these individuals, these men. These are 8 more individuals. And the previous slide showed foreigners, Egyptians, Saudis, Americans, Jordanians, a Comoran, who were fighting in someone else's war. This slide shows the local insurgent leaders who were leading the organizations that foreign fighters came to join. On the Afghan Mujahideen side, we have Abdul Rasul Saif and Jalaluddin Haqqani, who both hosted foreign Arab, in particular, volunteers in the 1980s, including bin Laden and Zawahiri. And their organizations really provided the venue where the modern jihadist foreign fighter phenomenon was born. We have, as he was then known, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, the leader of HTS, who broke from the Islamic State in Iraq to lead an insurgent organization in Syria that included foreign fighters, and was, of course, ultimately victorious. We have Shamil Basayev, who is the Chechen commander who forged a partnership with Ayman al-Khattab and the foreign fighters who came to fight the Russians in Chechnya, a war that they decisively lost. Then we have Hassan Dirhaway's, Ahmed Abdi Godane, and Ahmed Dere, who are three generations of Somali jihadist leaders whose organizations, including al-Ittihad al-Islami and al-Shabaab, really define the trajectory of foreign fighter influence in the Horn of Africa. And then last, we have Habibullah Akhundzada, the current emir of the Taliban, which is an organization which for over 20 years has cooperated with and harbored foreign fighters, but also constrained their influence on the insurgency in Afghanistan. So my argument is that these are the men who decide what foreign fighters got to do inside insurgencies, who they admitted, who they promoted, who they killed, who they expelled, etc. The relationship between these two sides, the foreigners and the locals, is really what my book is seeking to explore. So before I go any further, I want to sort of clarify the term that I'm focusing on, which is jihadist foreign fighters. And that involves 5 characteristics. 1, these are individuals who join insurgencies. The term that most people use is foreign fighters, but they don't necessarily have to join as fighters. They do have to join an insurgency, but they can be in a different role than a fighting specific role. Second, they're acting outside of state militaries. They are not soldiers in an army. They're not private military contractors. They're joining non-state armed groups. Third, they lack local ties. This means they don't have citizenship to the country that they're fighting in, and that they also don't have an ethnic or kinship connection to the warring parties in the conflict. This distinguishes them from other types of volunteers, which are ethnic kin or diaspora foreign fighters. And that distinction is pretty important in both the Somalia and Afghanistan case, when I'm saying that I'm not looking at ethnic Somalis who join the insurgency or Pashtuns who join the insurgency in Afghanistan. So I'm looking exclusively at fully foreign fighters, if you will. Fourth, foreign fighters are not primarily motivated by personal gain. They can get some compensation, but they're not mercenaries who are primarily motivated by their ability to gain resources or make money. And fifth, I'm looking specifically at Sunni jihadist foreign fighters. And those are ones who are motivated by a Sunni identity, who are really driven by the idea that they're fighting in defense of, in behalf of fellow Muslims and a cause that they are labeling a jihad. So these are the 5 characteristics that I'm referring to when I refer to jihadist foreign fighters or foreign fighters throughout this presentation and in the book. So to date, we've had in the work on foreign fighters, we've had 3 main areas, 3 main phases. And there's the before phase, which is why people become foreign fighters. How are they radicalized? How are they recruited? What are their pathways into the fight? And then we have the after the conflict phase, which is the threat that foreign fighters pose after a conflict resolves. What do returnees do? Where is the onward mobilization? What kind of security challenges do fighters generate once the war ends? And I would say this before and after phase has gotten pretty extensive coverage among scholars and by policymakers. But I am looking at this middle phase, the war phase, which, of course, there is an important body of work on, but is comparatively under-theorized. And this is really focusing on what foreign fighters do inside the insurgencies they join. How do they shape those insurgencies? How do those insurgencies shape them? So this is the focus of my book. And when we move into the wartime sequence, we have a sense of the first 4 steps based on previous literature. One is that often insurgents issue appeals to foreign fighters to come and join and support them. And then it's often external networks that take up the actual recruitment and mobilization effort. And then there comes questions of what is the size of the mobilization? How much access is there? And the previous scholarship on this suggests that factors like identity, geography, perceptions of success, conditions on the ground, really shape the size of the mobilization and access. how many would-be foreign fighters answer the call, and whether they can actually get to the battlefield to join the conflict, depending on what the government is doing to stop them. And this line of research also suggests that how fragmented an insurgency is matters, that fragmented insurgencies provide more opportunities for access. And then once they arrive, insurgent organizations have to decide whether to admit foreign fighters and which foreign fighters they will work with. And in particular, Barak Mendelsohn has done a lot of work on this question. And I'm taking this next step, step 5. I'm looking at what happens after admission. Once local insurgents decide to work with foreign fighters, what shapes their relationship? Who shapes whom? Who's controlling the cause? Who's controlling the violence? So this is really the relationship I'm focusing on in this book. And we have a fair number of benefits that local insurgents can garner from foreign fighters who join the conflict. They can, of course, bring capabilities like improving an insurgent group's fighting strength. They can import tactics that were developed elsewhere and train local fighters in their use. They can bring combat experience. They can bring sources of revenue. They can bring skills that local insurgents don't have. They have often been willing to take on dangerous work. They have been deployed on suicide missions or fight on the front lines or can fabricate explosive devices. But I think most consequentially, especially for this book, is that all of these potential contributions can have one important result for a local insurgent organization. They can give it an edge over rival groups within the insurgent movement. In other words, foreign fighters can help a local group improve its position within the insurgent movement. It's pretty rare that foreign fighters come in enough quantity and quality to change the balance of power between local insurgent organization and the government, but they can change the balance of power within the insurgent movement. But they're not an unmitigated benefit for the organizations that emit them. They also bring real costs. Those insurgent movements that emit foreign fighters experience more problems in terms of cohesion. Foreign fighters can contribute to competition between local insurgent groups and really damage the internal cohesion of both the movement as a whole and the specific groups that they join. And frankly, not all foreign fighters come with extensive combat experience or relevant combat experience. Sometimes they are just literally bodies that are not necessarily well equipped to fight in the terrain that is where the conflict is taking place, and have been frequently referred to as sort of jihadi tourists by the local insurgents who host them. They also have security consequences for local insurgents. They can expose local groups to surveillance and penetration by foreign intelligence services. They tend to attract more international attention, sanctions, drone strikes, and a host of other security problems for local insurgent groups. But most importantly for this book, foreign fighters have deleterious effects on the local insurgent group's relationship with the civilian population. Foreign fighters lack a personal stake in the conflict. This is not their land, their tribe, their family. They don't have a political future on the line in the place where they're fighting. And so that can often mean that ideology is trumping prudence. They behave brutally towards local civilians, or at least more brutally than local fighters do. They're not really bearing the long-term costs of alienating the population. And people who join voluntarily a conflict can often be thirsty to engage in action. So they'll be pushing for action, including attacks that may not benefit local insurgents' objectives or that may harm the local population. And they are often the ones who can push insurgent violence past the point that the local population will tolerate. When they're in high profile roles or leadership roles, they stoke resentment and alienation by the very constituency that a group is trying to win over. And so in the cost and benefit ledger, there's real pros and cons to foreign fighters. And the trade-offs can differ from conflict and group to group, depending on the circumstances. And so for me, the puzzle came down to this. In most cases, foreign fighters, not all cases, but most cases, foreign fighters are not more than 5% of the fighters. They're 5% or less of the combatants. But at the same time, their presence is correlated with disproportionate violence. When foreign fighters join a conflict, there are more battle deaths, there are more suicide attacks, there's more violence against civilians, there's more sexual violence. And that's puzzling that 5% of combatants have this outsized effect on violence. And so how does 5% of a fighting force that lacks local knowledge, language, connections, understanding of the norms of society have all of that effect? And so it creates this question, under what conditions would a relatively small group of fighters have these outsized effects on the conflict that they enter? And so I am shifting the focus, and my answer starts with a reframing. If foreign fighters are 5% of combatants, 95% of combatants are local insurgents. And my argument is that to really understand foreign fighter influence, we need to stop focusing on the foreign fighters and start looking more closely at the local insurgents, that 95% who decide what foreign fighters get to do when they arrive. Because local insurgents typically control most of the structures, the decision-making, the alliances, and as a consequence, they decide when foreign fighters can carve out influence in particular roles. In other words, foreign fighter influence is not really just a property of foreign fighters themselves, as the high-profile individuals I started the presentation with found. It's a function of what local insurgents permit, resist, or absorb. So I would argue that in order to understand foreign fighter influence, we have to shift our focus to study on the 95%, the local insurgent organizations that decide the terms of this relationship. So if foreign fighter influence is the puzzle, the answer runs through the local insurgents that they join. And to sort of give you the most simplified version of my argument, what I'm positing is that foreign fighters come to these conflicts seeking influence, and local insurgents enable or constrain that influence. It's not a relationship among equals. It's a relationship in which one party usually has more leverage than the other. And importantly, what I'm arguing is it's the strength of the local insurgent organization in two specific areas that determines how much influence foreign fighters can have. And that is the local insurgents' embeddedness and their orientation. So what do I mean by embeddedness? Specifically, I'm talking about the local insurgent organization's relationship with its constituency. And that I want to emphasize that point. It is the part of the population that the local insurgent group sees itself as fighting on behalf of. That may or may not be the entire population. In some cases it is, and in some cases it is not. So I'm focused on a local insurgent organization's relationship with its constituency. And I'm focused on the idea of embeddedness. And by this, I mean an organization's ability to reliably secure compliance, acquiescence, and engagement from the people it claims to represent, and to be able to exert what David Kilcullen calls competitive control over them, meaning that the local insurgent group can keep other actors, including the state, from exercising authority in its space. But embeddedness is not synonymous with support. A local insurgency, the constituency may comply with a local insurgent organization that it does not endorse and that it does not love. It's a question of whether the organization can extract from its constituency what it needs, not how the constituency feels about the local insurgent organization. And so how does this bring in foreign fighters? What I argue is that when a local insurgent organization is strongly embedded in its constituency, it will constrain foreign fighter influence. Why is that? Because the organization has something valuable that it needs to protect, its relationship with its constituency. And because it has this embedded relationship with its constituency, it doesn't need foreign fighters to sustain the fight. It can rely on its constituents for recruits, support, resources, etc. But when an organization is weakly embedded, when it's facing resistance, revolt, or indifference from its constituency, it is more receptive to foreign fighter influence. because foreign fighters become an alternative pipeline. They become something that can substitute for the recruit support and resources that the constituency is not consistently providing. So sort of the thrust of the argument is that local insurgent embeddedness is what will constrain foreign fighter influence. So then there's the second component, which is orientation. And the way to think about orientation is that where the local insurgent organization sits within the insurgent movement. So, of course, insurgent movements often contain multiple organizations that are rivaling and fighting both the government and competing with each other for primacy. And so orientation is an organization's stance towards its position within the insurgent movement. And I argue that there are three orientations, building on Peter Krause's work on this topic. First, there are status quo organizations. These are the organizations that are satisfied with their position in the insurgent movement. And this status quo orientation creates a conservativeness and a risk avoidance. These are groups that are protecting what they have, and so they will be more reluctant to take on foreign fighters who might cost them standing in the movement through their violence and through their behavior. And so status quo organizations will be the least receptive to foreign fighter influence. Second, we have revisionist organizations. These are organizations that are seeking to improve their position within the insurgent movement. These organizations are thus willing to take on some risk in order to do so. And foreign fighters are a potential source of capabilities, resources, manpower that can improve an organization's standing. So these organizations will be receptive to some foreign fighter influence in their effort to improve their position within the local insurgent movement. And finally, there are frustrated organizations. These local insurgent organizations are stuck. They're not able to improve their positions. They are essentially in a weak position and they can't do anything about it. And these organizations are particularly risk acceptance. These are organizations that we often see acting as spoilers during negotiations or using violence much more indiscriminately in a way that is not strategically valuable. And these organizations essentially have nothing to lose. And with their receptivity to both risk and violence, these are organizations that will be the most receptive to foreign fighter influence and what foreign fighters bring. So the argument is essentially that receptivity to foreign fighter influence rises as we shift from status quo to revisionist to frustrated. And of course, like a good academic, I have a typology that is the interaction between embeddedness and orientation. And this typology outlines 6 possible types of relationships between local insurgent organizations and the foreign fighters they admit. And so the row is embeddedness and the column is orientation. And so we have in the first combination, strongly embedded organizations that have a status quo orientation. And I'm arguing that this will produce a subordinate relationship where local insurgents call all of the shots and foreign fighters essentially are instruments of the local insurgents. Foreign fighters operate solely on local insurgent groups' terms, and they're constrained and kept in narrow roles that are advantageous. Then, in a situation where a group is strongly embedded but revisionist, we will see co-optation. The local insurgents are still in charge in the relationship. They're still the ones calling the shots, but they will work carefully and strategically with foreign fighters in an effort to improve their position. It will be on the local insurgents' terms because they still have to protect their relationship with their constituency. And then when a group is strongly embedded and frustrated, the relationship would be appropriation. And I have to admit that this is probably empirically rare, a situation where you have a group that is strongly embedded and frustrated. Perhaps the organization defines its constituency very, very narrowly in these situations. And as I'll show later, it turns out that I don't find any instances of that. Moving along the bottom row, when a group is weakly embedded in status quo, I'm arguing that this relationship will be incorporated. Foreign fighters will be absorbed into the organization deeply, but on the local group's terms. Then when an organization is weakly embedded and revisionist, we'll see a partnership. And this is a genuinely collaborative relationship in which foreign fighters share decision-making and operational space with local insurgents. It's a genuine sort of reciprocal relationship that is balanced between foreign fighters and local insurgents. And then when a local organization is weakly embedded and frustrated, foreign fighters can take the opportunity to exert more autonomy in their action, and on the extreme end, fully take over a local insurgent group. In other words, the local insurgent group will have lost the levers and foreign fighters are essentially in charge. And so what you see from this is there's an imbalance in the typology on purpose. In subordinate, co-opted, and incorporated relationships, the local insurgents are the dominant actor, and that is by design. In a partnership, you have this 50-50 type relationship, and it's in rarer circumstances that I expect foreign fighters will actually be the ones making the decisions and making the calls. So I undertook, in my cases, looking at 2 countries, 4 conflicts over about 40 years. And I looked specifically at 4 factions during the anti-Soviet war in Afghanistan from 79 to 89, and looked at the relationship between local insurgents and these 4 local insurgent organizations and foreign fighters. And then I shifted to look at Somalia during the civil war in the early 1990s. This is specifically looking at al-Ittihad al-Islami, as well as a breakaway faction that I uncovered in my research on this conflict, as well as looking at the sort of notorious claims about Mohammed Farah Aidid's relationship with foreign fighters. And then I looked over the course of several chapters at the post-9/11 insurgency in Afghanistan. And I looked from 2021 to the Taliban's return from 2001 to the Taliban's return in 2021. And I look at the Afghan Taliban, and I also dive into the different factions of the Afghan Taliban, because there's variation in how the different factions had relationships with foreign fighters, probably most notably the Haqqani network, but also other factions within the Taliban. I would say I briefly look at ISK as a secondary case, but I mostly focus on understanding the change in relationship between local insurgents and foreign fighters over the course of that insurgency. And then finally, I look at the insurgency in Somalia after the Ethiopian intervention in 2006 till about 2024. Al-Shabaab is my primary case, looking over time at relations between local insurgents and foreign fighters. I also look at the Ras Kamboni faction in a brief period early in the conflict where it was working with foreign fighters, and briefly also examine the Islamic State in Somalia. So what I was doing with this array is looking at variation over time within conflicts. So I'm able to look over the course of each 4 of these conflicts. I'm also looking over time in the lifespan of the Sunni jihadist movement, from its sort of earliest phase to basically up till a couple of years ago. I'm looking across organizations within the same complex, as well as looking across organizations across conflicts. And of course, I want to explain foreign fighter and local insurgent relations in Afghanistan and Somalia above all, but I also want to be able to develop claims about dynamics more broadly between jihadist foreign fighters and local insurgents. So obviously, I bit off a lot empirically here, and I don't want to keep you here all day. But I do want to talk to you about perhaps one of the more interesting and notable findings, which is looking at the Taliban insurgency post-2001 and the al-Shabaab insurgency post-2006. And what's interesting about the trajectory of these 2 insurgencies, as foreign fighters are present right at the outset. And at the outset of both of these conflicts, the organization al-Shabaab was embedded with the Islamic Court Union, and the Taliban suffered pretty significant military defeats that then spurred the insurgency. So they were both in really weakened positions at the outset of the insurgency. And with this combination of being in this weakened position where their relationship with their constituencies had either been broken in the case of the Taliban or didn't really previously exist for the al-Shabaab faction specifically, and trying to carve out some dominance within the insurgency, both the Taliban and al-Shabaab had partnerships with foreign fighters in the early years of the conflict. So there was disproportionate foreign fighter influence considering their limited numbers. But over time, as the Taliban gained dominance within the insurgent movement in Afghanistan, and al-Shabaab became the strongest insurgent organization in Somalia, they moved to take more and more power over foreign fighters. They shift into an incorporated relationship where foreign fighters still have some influence, but it is more and more circumscribed and more tailored to specific areas. And then as both insurgent organizations develop or redevelop their embeddedness with their constituencies, they then move to subordinate foreign fighters. And foreign fighters are exerting virtually no influence over the insurgencies in the later years. And what's interesting about this, of course, is that there was these parallel tracks across the two. But it also reveals that these relationships can be positive, even as local insurgents maintain or gain more and more influence and subordinate foreign fighters. These relationships can remain positive. However, interestingly, in both cases, when foreign fighters resisted this greater domination by local insurgents were willing to use violence against foreign fighters to ensure that they did gain primacy over them. So this was a particularly interesting finding in the common trajectory across them. Both groups really converged on the same path of progressively asserting more and more control over foreign fighters. And this might not be what most people assume. It can sometimes appear that foreign fighters arrive and take over. Or if we only look at foreign fighter influence at its peak, we can lose this understanding of the trajectory, that they were there at the outset. They did have significant influence and outsized influence early. But as the local insurgent group became stronger in these two specific ways, they really become more and more constrained. I'll just briefly touch on what the overall findings were about sort of the set of relationships across all of those cases. If you combine the incorporated, subordinated, and co-opted, the three types of relationships that the local insurgents are dominant, this happens in a slight majority of the cases. So local insurgents, most of the time, were the dominant actor in the relationship. But if we just look at the one type of relationship that is most common, it was in fact partnerships. So that foreign fighters were able to have disproportionate influence in a number of cases. As I mentioned before, appropriation did not turn out to be something I saw empirically. But also interestingly, the situations where foreign fighters actually took over were quite rare. I did see a couple instances where foreign fighters for a period of time carved out some autonomy and were able to operate in the ways that they saw fit. And I saw one case of a takeover where foreign fighters really managed to completely seize a local insurgent group. And what was interesting about this is this was also temporary. That faction was brought sort of back under the broader local insurgent movement, and it ended the foreign fighter dominance over it after a period of time. So it's interesting. I think overall my takeaway here is that local insurgents are really dominant in these relationships, but there are these configurations where local insurgent groups are weak and foreign fighters are able to get this sort of partner-like relationship and have outsized. So in other words, the 95% usually hold the levers, but the 5% can punch above their weight when those levers slip and there are weaknesses. But even then, it's very rare that foreign fighters are in charge. And even when it happens, it doesn't necessarily persist over time. So that brings me to my implications. And as somebody who has had this sort of practitioner and academic career, what I would say is that counterterrorism policy has often treated foreign fighters as the central object of concern. Governments are designing sanctions around them, targeting lists around them, travel restrictions, etc. And I'm not saying that's wrong, because foreign fighters do cause harm and can have disproportionate influence. But if my argument is right, it requires a reordering of priorities in a counterinsurgency strategy, even when foreign fighters are present. And the core idea would be to start with local insurgents. If foreign fighter influence runs through local insurgents, then we need to flip the analytic default posture and begin with the local insurgent group rather than beginning with the foreign fighters. Begin by mapping the local insurgent group's embeddedness, mapping its orientation, understanding its competition, and then asking what foreign fighters are doing inside the insurgency. And too often, in my experience, we start with the foreign fighters. We count them, we name them, we know them well, we watch them closely, and only later do we ask about the local context. And that order is not the best counterinsurgency strategy. Second is that foreign fighter influence can be an important diagnostic indicator. And I think this is in particular what I want people to take away. And that is that if local insurgents are strong, foreign fighters are really instruments of the group's agenda. They're not exerting independent influence, even so when they sometimes seem very visible. But when foreign fighters are in charge, when they're the ones driving decisions, it's a diagnostic sign that the local insurgent group is weak. And that local weakness is something that counterinsurgency strategies should focus on. So the headline isn't we have a foreign fighter problem. The headline is the local insurgent group's strength is slipping, and foreign fighter influence is a symptom of that. The third takeaway I'd like to highlight is that this is not a static relationship. As I discussed with al-Shabaab and the Taliban, foreign fighter influence can rise and fall. And it did rise and fall with local insurgent strength. And as the local insurgent group consolidated its strength, foreign fighter influence declined. The Taliban, 20 years after 2001, managed al-Qaida very differently than it did in the early phases of the insurgency. Al-Shabaab today manages foreign fighters very differently than it did in 2007. And so analysis of these relationships does have a shelf life. And an assessment 5 years ago about foreign fighter influence may be wrong today, not because the analysis was bad, but because the relationship has changed because the local insurgents' capabilities have changed. And then finally, there is a cost to weakening local insurgent groups that counterinsurgents have to consider. There is an unintended consequence, which is the weakening of a local insurgent group can pave the way for more foreign fighter influence. And of course, that's the goal, is to weaken these insurgent organizations, to kill their leaders, fragment their networks, etc. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I'm saying that those actions can create more space for foreign fighter influence. And foreign fighter influence, we know, can mean that there is more brutality towards civilians, there's more violence, there's more death. And so that can also make the conflict more difficult to resolve. And so this is the counterinsurgency dilemma that I'm highlighting. The pressure on local insurgent groups can result in more foreign fighter influence. So there needs to be preparation that the success creates counterproductive conditions that the next round of pressure will have to adjust. And I'm, of course, not saying we shouldn't pressure these organizations, but just understanding the way that foreign fighters will fit into that and what the downstream consequences will be of those actions. So with that, I'm happy to open it up for questions. I want to thank Asmia again for hosting me today for this discussion. And also, thank American University for its support for the 7 years of field research, archival research, and a lot of maybe travel that universities don't necessarily love when you do. So I'm very appreciative for American for its support for that. So with that, I'll turn it over to questions.
Great. Tricia, thank you for all of that. That's very thorough research, and obviously you've devoted a great amount of time to put all of this together, and we appreciate that. And there's clearly a lot to discuss. I have many questions, and there's a lot, obviously, policy, and you obviously wear the two hats of from your policy world and the academic world. So. One of the interesting case studies, obviously, I just want to kind of see, as far as lessons learned that you've tackled, a case study of obviously a Julani. And so here an example where you have a reformed, force, as far as into legalized power, is now the dominant force when it comes to governing Syria today. What are the pressure points policy-wise of negotiating, from a policy standpoint, from dealing with them as insurgency groups and foreign fighters and whatnot? And here you have like now that the dominant force that we have now there, and maybe, to kind of extrapolate from there in a different case study, where you have a Hamas who's trying to now also reinvent themselves as a force of law and order. In that entire dynamic, are there pressure points where we can control from the U.S. standpoint, or is the mentality still the same, only under a different title, but the mentality and the psychology is still the same? You're sorry, Tricia,
We still make those mistakes.
go
That's a
ahead.
really interesting question. And I've thought about the Syria case in particular quite a bit. It's not a case study, obviously, in the book, but it's an important case of understanding jihadist foreign fighters. And I think a comparison of the Islamic State and HTS and how they approach foreign fighters is also a sort of a relevant way of thinking about this. And when you examine those two, you can see the contrast. The Islamic State was an unembedded organization that was highly revisionist in its approach to the insurgent movement. It basically fought other insurgent organizations as much as the Assad government at times, and it allowed extensive foreign fighter influence. And so, in contrast, HTS worked with foreign fighters, but had a more calibrated relationship with them because it was embedded in the insurgency, and it was trying to have a more allied and collaborative approach with other insurgent organizations. And so it had some space for foreign fighters throughout much of the insurgency, but it largely was calling the shots. And that, of course, only became more pronounced when HTS took over in Syria. And so you can see that it is adopting a subordinated approach to foreign fighters, which is to try to integrate them into the security forces and essentially deny them independent influence, while maintaining a positive relationship, but not allowing them to exert influence that goes against HTS's goals. And again, that the transition to that kind of relationship is not necessarily seamless, and we have seen some resistance in Syria from foreign fighters to HTS's efforts to do this. But in a lot of ways, HTS has followed that trajectory. And of course, in that sense, locally, foreign fighters are less of a threat once they are subordinated to the local, in this case, government, essentially. This doesn't what I'm talking about is really focused on the insurgency piece of it. Of course, foreign fighters can be an external threat that merits watching for separate reasons. But I think within the context of HTS, what we've seen is this subordination of foreign fighters, but an unwillingness to abdicate them entirely. I haven't looked as closely at Hamas because they have not really had the same type of relationship with foreign fighters. And that's in part at the earlier phases of the war phase that I talked about. And that is the accessibility problem. While of course it would be highly symbolic for Sunni jihadist foreign fighters to join the conflict in Gaza, for example, it's not a conflict that they have been able to access. There was a brief period that I looked at in the early 2000s where there was a small number of foreign fighters who were able to access Gaza. But other than that, Israeli measures have really prevented jihadist foreign fighters from actually being able to participate in that conflict. And so Hamas hasn't really had to negotiate that same kind of dynamic with foreign fighters and how it would have relationships with them as a result. So it's because of a prevention earlier in the process that there hasn't been the same kind of involvement of foreign fighters.
So on that front, just to kind of jump back on that issue, what about the on the Hamas front and similar to these other groups and the Islamist groups that we've been seeing outside of their local territory when it comes to the funding? The use and abuse of charities as far as, and to your point, the connection between the influence of foreign fighters and the local insurgencies. Is there a reciprocity there between the fundraising element regarding some of the monies coming in from the foreign fighters and their fighting on the ground and their influence as far as raising money in the West? I mean, is that also a dimension that you've looked at regarding A, their credibility, and B, trying to get, more recruitment in that regard as far as we're seeing? I mean, some of what we've seen now with some of these Islamist organizations is the fundraising happening in Europe and in the United States, and obviously also now in a different constellation regarding the Iranian front and the entire kind of syndicate narrative that Hezbollah has as far as the use of their financial enterprise and the locality. I mean, so is there a similar architecture that we can see and look at when it comes to the case studies that you've been studying, and can we learn from that as far as freezing assets, I guess?
It's interesting when I think about the role of financing, because it certainly does come up in all of the conflicts that I looked at. In the 1980s in Afghanistan, the first half of the conflict, the local insurgent groups did not want foreign fighters. They wanted their money, right? And so it was much more about the financial pipeline than the foreign fighters themselves. The foreign fighters were sort of something that they had to accept in order to keep those pipelines alive. In the al-Shabaab case, initially, foreign fighters are an important source of these external pipelines of funding, and that contributes to their early influence. But then they sort of show a downside to that. It can be easy to forget that al-Shabaab was one of the really early influential groups on social media. The Westgate attacks, essentially the group live tweeted them, and it really sort of broke new ground on that front. But that turned out to also have a downside, which was that foreign fighters could use social media to start to criticize al-Shabaab when things were not going as they wanted it to go. And what we see with al-Shabaab is it over time became entirely domestically funded. It was able to generate sufficient revenue domestically, which is a really important way of thing to understand about al-Shabaab in order to combat it. It does not rely on external donor fundraising. It's able to generate more than enough resources domestically through its taxation process. But the reduced need for foreign fighters to help provide those connections to external donors was part of what contributed to their loss of influence. So foreign fighters can bring those connections, but when they're not needed anymore, that was part of what the story was with al-Shabaab. It's interesting when you raise the Iran piece of it. So one of the questions that I have been asked is, would these findings apply to situations where you have Shia foreign fighters? And I think the answer to that is probably not. Because we do then have the state hierarchy, which is one of the things I sort of say at the outset of foreign fighters. They're not being sent by states. They're not being fighting on behalf of a state or something to have some kind of that relationship. And with the Iranians and Shia foreign fighters, you immediately have that hierarchy of the Iranian role in that. At least to my knowledge, I'm not aware of any conflicts where there were Shia foreign fighters where they weren't fighting, for example, on behalf of a state or at least being partially managed by a state. So I don't think that some of these same findings apply in that context. But there are probably some people on this call who've studied the Shia side of things more closely than I have, who I would be keen to hear their thoughts on it as well. So I think that the Iran side of the sort of axis of resistance does bring different considerations into play than the Sunni jihadist side because of that hierarchy.
So on that note, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, you're making the clear the distinction between the Sunni and the Shia, structure. On the Iran multi-front war that we've been dealing with, Iran obviously took it upon itself to also fund both Sunnis and Shiites vis-a-vis Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. I mean, so how does that management fall into the proper sketch that you lay out as far as the structure of this, and how do you deal with that, as far as a Sunni Shia divide, and here you have a group that's trying to manage them both on a greater evil or a greater cause.
Right. And that gets at maybe a broader question, which is how to think about Hamas. And Hamas has never really been integrated into the Sunni jihadist movement because it's occupied this strange space of being a Sunni group but also being a nationalist group that is a Iranian proxy. And so it has not really fallen into a clearly into the Sunni jihadist movement. And you can see there's also often been a tense relationship between, of course, the Islamic State and Hamas, and for many years between al-Qaida and Hamas too. So Hamas, obviously, to your point, is Sunni, but it's not really integrated into the Sunni jihadist movement overall because of that relationship with the Iranians. So I think that that's one of the oddities of this. In addition to not having foreign fighters, as I mentioned before, that would be another sort of like asterisk next to Hamas in terms of understanding how to think about them within this context.
Correct. On the issue of the foreign fighters, I mean, can you touch upon the element of the sleeper cells? As far as in their local countries. I mean, do they play that dual role between offer the opportunity, like with some of these Islamist groups that we're seeing out there, as far as the financial zakat arm, the charitable arm of these groups, and their locales versus the foreign fighter aspect. I mean, does that dynamic play out in any way, shape, or form? Can you have that role and still be considered to be a foreign fighter, and also play that duality that plays out?
Yes, I think we've seen some of that with al-Shabaab specifically, which is that they're over time, as al-Shabaab subordinated foreign fighters more and more. One of the things that they did was stop having them reducing their role within the conflict in Somalia, and instead would sometimes bring them to Somalia to get training and then send them back home. And so they essentially ceased to become foreign fighters at that point. And it was interesting because one of my interviewees sort of characterized it by saying they don't want them to make trouble within Somalia. And they find utility for them back home in perhaps what you're describing, which is more of this sleeper cell type of role where they can execute attacks back at home, especially, for example, in Kenya. And they're not foreign fighters anymore. Of course, their experience in Somalia shaped their capabilities and their exposure to al-Shabaab. But al-Shabaab, increasingly, rather than using them as foreign fighters, wanted to use them for external attack capability. So that is, of course, very important from a terrorist threat, management standpoint and prevention standpoint. But was an evolution in al-Shabaab's approach to foreign fighters because there were these tensions and difficulties they were having with overambitious foreign fighters and what those foreign fighters wanted in terms of influence within Somalia. So that part of it was, of course, a desire to strike in Kenya because of its role in the AU and its role, again, of combating al-Shabaab. But part of it was also driven by a change in how al-Shabaab managed foreign fighters.
Right. Interesting, we spoke about this offline before we started, but just to kind of go back to that point, I mean, now with the emergence, as far as Somaliland, can you talk about some of the differences as far as policy between Somalia and Somaliland when it comes to al-Shabaab and fighting terrorism? Obviously, Somaliland has been very strong on combating this stuff, and yet they are they're the beginning of a recognition of them, as far as the center of power. But, this is the differences in as far as how that plays into current policy making.
I think that the recognition of Somaliland by Israel is going to reignite al-Shabaab's desire to conduct attacks there. It hasn't really conducted major attacks in Somaliland for probably about 20 years, a little less than 20 years. Somaliland had done an effective job at essentially sort of pushing that threat beyond its borders. And of course, it does have a well-developed security apparatus, as well as just a really robust social contract where people will report to the government when foreigners or people that are not known to them appear. That social contract is very strong in Somaliland in ways that we don't necessarily see in Somalia. But undoubtedly, from al-Shabaab's perspective, it has frequently invoked al-Qaeda's rhetoric about Israel. It attributed several attacks to the Jerusalem will not be Judaicized campaign, attacks of what it conducted anyway in Kenya, for example, but it sort of, from a propaganda standpoint, brought them under that framework. So I think the developments in Somaliland have probably instigated more dedication by al-Shabaab to try to find ways to repenetrate Somaliland and strike there again. And of course, there is this really interesting parallel development of al-Shabaab's cooperation with the Houthis and what that is producing in terms of their ability to disrupt maritime traffic in the Red Sea, and as well as improving some of al-Shabaab's capability. Al-Shabaab is an organization that is not generally all that high tech. It's well suited to its environment, but has not necessarily had a lot of indigenous high tech capability. But there's a lot of reporting indicating that the Houthis are undertaking cooperation that might be improving that side of al-Shabaab's capability, which is part of course, then the threat to Somaliland as well.
That's great. Great. Listen, Tricia, I want to thank you for coming and talking to us this afternoon. There's a lot to unpack here, and I really thank you for your research. It's obviously critical at this point in time trying to dissect all of this. So I want to, and obviously we will be sending out, I believe you put in a coupon code for anybody who wants to purchase the book. Of course, I hope we will see what the conference, we can talk more about this live in November. And as things develop, we hope we can come back as well. I want to thank my colleagues, Suzanne and Emily, as always, for joining me, and everybody else who joined us this afternoon. But we will definitely be in touch and take everything out to heart here, because obviously, things in the Middle East and in the region are fluid, and the research is critical to understand the mindsets and the policy implications. So really, thank you as always for what you're doing, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, as always, to Asmia for the support. And thank you to everyone for coming today.
Thank you.